Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So here we are in the 10th year of Nubuwwah. The Prophet ﷺ has been doing everything he can to spread this message of La ilaha illallah to his people, to his brothers, to his family members, people who knew him as Al-Amin, As-Sadiq, the truthful and the trustworthy one. He's doing all he can for these 10 years and he's leaving no stone unturned, using everything he has in his power to speak to people, to win hearts over. People lost lives. People were tortured. People were going through so much torment, torture, and struggle just for La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. The Prophet ﷺ had lost his support. He had lost his external support, Abu Talib. That meant so much to him. And he also lost his internal rock of support, Khadija, radiyallahu an. So in the 10th year of Nubuwwah, the Prophet ﷺ makes up a strategic move. He says, you know what? I'm going to go over to Ta'if, the neighboring city. Ironically, Ta'if was right where he was suckled and nursed by Halima as-Sa'diyah when he was a young baby. So he makes up his mind that I'm going to go there and I'm going to call them to support me. I'm going to call them to believe in me so that I can spread this message. I need the support of people. I need the support of a clan to spread this message. Can't be done alone. So the Prophet ﷺ, he sets out on foot, him and Zayd ibn Harith, who at that time, we have to remember the context, at that time Zayd ibn Haritha was known as Zayd bin Muhammad. Though he was only a few years younger than the Prophet ﷺ, he had spent so many years with the Prophet ﷺ because Zayd was a freed slave of Khadija radiallahu ta'ala an, who she gifted to the Prophet ﷺ. But nonetheless, Zayd and the Prophet ﷺ are so tight that his nickname was Zayd, the son of Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. They set out on foot. Some scholars say they set out on foot so they didn't, no one would notice. Where's Muhammad going? Oh, he's just going on foot. He can't be going too far. Lo and behold, he's going pretty far. He's going all the way to Ta'if. The Prophet ﷺ then arrives at Ta'if. And when the Prophet ﷺ arrives at Ta'if, he immediately heads to the leaders of Ta'if with the intention of starting at the top. If I can persuade them, if I can talk to them, then the entire tribe will accept Islam or support me. So he goes to Mas'ud, he goes to Abdul Yalil, he goes to these three brothers, and he goes and talks to each and every one of them, their leaders of their tribe. And when he speaks to them, unbefittingly and uncustomarily, they showed him such harshness that was not the norm for a visiting guest, let alone someone from Quraysh, someone that was well known in Quraysh and loved in Quraysh. One of them, he says, when the Prophet speaks about this message in Islam, he says, if this is true, I'll rip up the curtain of the Kaaba. Another one, he looks at the Prophet ﷺ and he says, Allah couldn't find someone better than you. And I want you to think about who he's saying that to. I want you to think about the maqam, the level of Rasulullah ﷺ. I want you to reflect on who this man ﷺ was. His birth, what did it represent for the universe? What did it represent for the coming of the Day of Judgment? This final prophet, this seal of prophets. And he looks at him and he says, Allah couldn't find someone better than you. And the last one, he says, I don't want to speak to you. He has some weird logic. He says, if you're a prophet, well, you're too big. I can't talk to a prophet. You're a prophet. And if you're not a prophet, well, why should I speak to a liar? He was just finding excuses not to talk. So the Prophet ﷺ, he talks to them and he talks to them and he says, you know what? Okay, here's what I'm going to ask you. And though this is important to understanding holistically the situation that the Prophet ﷺ was in, he says, look, if you don't accept the message, then I'm going to ask two favors. Number one, don't tell the people back in Mecca. The Prophet was worried, what if the Quraysh hear that I came to Ta'if to get support? That could be seen as treason. That could be seen as a hostile move. And the other thing, he says, well, just let me talk to the people. At first, they just let him go. And what people don't realize is the Prophet spent, according to two narrations, one narration says he spent 10 days in Ta'if. Another narration, which is weaker, says he spent 30 days in Ta'if. The point is, it wasn't just one night, one day. The Prophet then goes around this city, and I want you to imagine, I want you to imagine what it would feel like to be going from individual to individual, trying to give them dawah, talk to them, only to be turned away, turned away, turned away, turned away. Finally, the three leaders of Banu Thaqif, the people of Ta'if, they get upset, they're worried. They're worried about the influence of this message, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. They're worried about it. So now what do they do? They say, you have to leave here. We've had enough. You've been here for 10 days now. It's time for you to leave. But they didn't just let him walk out. And this is what is considered, on the tongue of the Prophet himself, alayhi salam, the hardest day in his life. They get all the youngins. They get all the young ones to start picking up rocks and taunting, yelling, screaming at the Prophet. Just imagine throngs of people yelling at him, get out of here, get out of here, throwing stuff at him. And then they set up two lines, two rows of people, not to escort him kindly out, but rather to stone him as they made him leave the city. And there he is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I want you to think of something here. He is the most compassionate of people. He is the most gentle of people. But he is also the bravest of people. He's also the strongest of people. And we see that so clearly later in the seerah. But this wasn't the time for that. See, there's a time for everything, brothers and sisters. And so the Prophet ﷺ is forced to walk down this alley of people, these people threatening and throwing rocks at him. And the narration says, they purposefully would throw the rocks at his ankles so that the rocks would hit the bone. And whenever he would feel the pain, he would fall down to the ground to cover his legs, and then they would lift him back up to make him keep walking. This is what they did to the Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's covered in blood. Zayd bin Muhammad is covering him, trying to protect him. He himself gets hit in the head with a rock. Finally, the Prophet ﷺ makes it out of the city. Toughest day of his life, stoned, pushed out, humiliated, covered in blood. He collapses in the garden of Utbah and Shayba, two of his staunchest enemies. The scholars, they say he saw that they saw him. And it even hurt that these people who dislike me are seeing me in this state. And here we come to one of the most beautiful moments of this moment in his life. Utbah and Shayba, they have a slave named Addas. And they ask Addas to take some grapes over to the Prophet, because they see the Prophet and Zayd in this pain and they feel some pity for him. Addas takes the grapes over, and while he was taking the grapes over, the Prophet read the most beautiful dua that one of our scholars will speak about in the next session. But I just want to reflect for a moment more on this interaction with Addas. The grapes are brought over, and as the grapes are brought over, the Prophet ﷺ puts his hand towards the grapes, and he says, Bismillah. And in that moment, Addas was taken back, because Bismillah wasn't a normal phrase that he heard people in the Arabs saying. He realized this was different. This isn't what I've heard these people. So he says to him, he says, where did you learn this from? Where did you people don't say this. The Prophet says, where are you from? He says, I'm from Nineveh. The Prophet sits back and he says, my brother's from there. Who's your brother? My brother is Jonah. Jonah? What do you know about Jonah? Look at this moment here. And in that moment, Utbah and Sheba are watching from a distance and they see the interaction they can't hear. And the next thing they see is Addas kissing the hands and the feet. The same hands that were stoned, the same feet that were stoned by some, were kissed by a slave because he realized who this man was. Brothers and sisters, it was an ascent after anguish. We have to recognize and tap into the anguish of the Prophet ﷺ so that we can appreciate the blessing of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And the lesson that we learn is that in our darkest moments, the light is right around the corner. May Allah bless us. May Allah accept. And may Allah give us a love for the Habib sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.